Thank you, Walter, for your prayer. I know a lot of you know Walter. Some of you may have seen him around last year and you wondered, where did he go? And all of a sudden he's back again. He's been in Arkansas working on a doctor's degree, studying how to cure cancer by picking out the cancer cells as they move through the bloodstream, isolating them as they pass through, and zapping. If I got a pretty accurate, rough, ordinary terminology there, I know he still looks like a high school student. He'll appreciate that in about 30 more years, as I enjoy now looking like I'm only 25. I look younger than 80 at least, and that's pretty good. So, Walter and Caitlin and Kelsey and Alex. I don't see him. He must be down. Are you here, Alex? Downstairs working. And Dennis. Got a bigger crowd here tonight. And Leah and Lily. Si me trae el pasaporte. That's a little Spanish jab here for Leah. All those are going Nicaragua this coming Friday. That's like the day after tomorrow. I'm picking on Leah because she hadn't given me her passport yet to get a picture of it. So she also knows Spanish better than I do, so I've got to pick on her somewhat while we're here because she's going to show me up when we get down there, which is good. So keep us in your prayers. Question here is, before we get into the lesson, I promise I will finish early because everybody's been starting, and the next one did it shorter, so tonight's got to be even shorter so we can get to the coffee and donuts quicker, right? Amen. So, do you believe that we're going to encounter some opportunities to share the word while we're down there in Nicaragua? Yes? Okay. Why? Because that's why we're going. We're going to go looking for those opportunities. So let me throw this out. While we're down there those 11 days, look for an opportunity for you at some part to step out of your comfort zone and share God's word with somebody. Picked up a penny one day. Somebody dropped on the floor checkout at Walmart, and I said, "Here's your penny." She goes, "Well, thank you." I'm like, "Big deal." I said, "Every penny says in God we trust." And I said, I pick every one of them up to remind me I've got a God that trusts me. I go to a good church, by the way. You know, hand it to her. If there's an opportunity, take advantage of it. Okay, so anyway, Esther. Strange book in the Bible. Not because it's about a woman, because I think that's a neat thing. There are heroes that are heroines. Not heroine, but heroine, or whatever, however you pronounce it. A hero that's a woman. This is a strange book because it doesn't mention the name God to start with. What's a book in the Bible doing in the Bible if it doesn't mention God? But it tells us a whole lot about providence of God, direction of God, control of God, or guiding things, and so much more. So we're seeing God working in the background, although his name is never mentioned. His people are, and matter of fact, that's a whole lot of the topic of the book, is how God's people could have easily been wiped out. Another thing to realize as we're looking at this short book is that although you don't see it within the pages of this is an extremely ruthless time. And although Esther's this beautiful maiden and she gets picked out, it sounds like a fairy tale, the guy that's the king will take your head off if he doesn't like you. Just like that. Matter of fact, if you just flip over, let's see here, chapter 4 and verse 11, while there's a little bit of a discussion going on whether Esther should go see the king or not go see the king, there's an explanation. Although she's found good favor with this guy by this time, there's a good reason why she's still hesitant. And verse 11, I believe it is, I write that down here, yes, says that all the king's servants and the people of the king's province know. In other words, it's without a doubt, everybody knows in this area that any man or woman who goes into the inner court of the king who has not been called, in other words, if the king calls for you to come, you come. If he doesn't, don't show. Those who try it and have not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. So you better put on a good smile, a good showing, and a bathe well, shave well, and whatever else. Because if he goes, and doesn't extend it out, you're gone. Now that's just an indication, if that is a law, how ruthless this type of area is. So this beautiful woman Esther that we'll read about here and talk about and discuss some of her things, actually has got her life on the line in the midst of all of this. And it's not as all beautiful as it seems, but there is a lot of unusual things in there. Another thing that you'll notice in here from the very beginning is that listening is an important attribute that's highlighted. First of all, by the king himself. As a little bit of discussion is going on in chapter 1, after there's some things going on, we might as well just read what it is here, because the king had a queen. Her name is Vashti, or however you want to pronounce it. And so he makes this royal feast for the women in the royal palace, etc. And verse 10 says, and on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded, and there's several names in here, I won't try to pronounce all of them, these people, and 7 eunuchs who served in these presence of the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to all the people and the officials, for she was a beautiful person to behold. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused. Now that's guts. She refused to come, and I'm not sure all the ins and outs of that, or how she was supposed to be dressed or whatever in order to show herself off. You can imagine all kinds of unusual things, but she doesn't come. She refuses the king's command, and therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. And then verse 13, before he did anything, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for there was a king's manner toward all then, and he called them in and he consulted with them. Instead of just exploding and taking her head off, which he could have done, he wanted to stop and analyze this. And what he did was he asked for advice. Now, we'll get into the story here in just a moment, but this idea of asking for advice isn't just a king's thing. But in chapter 2, in verses 19 to 20, when all these virgins gathered together a second time, Mordecai, this is now Esther's uncle, I know we're kind of jumping around here, but just capture this. He sat at the gate. Now Esther had not been revealed to her, Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, so they didn't know who she was as far as her background, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the commands of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. He's an uncle. Mom and Dad died some time ago, so he's taking care of her. She's now mentioning here is listening to Mordecai's advice. And if you're not just breezing through and just looking for the beautiful woman story, there's occasions in here where there are people that could jump off the deep end and do some dumb things, and they stop and they ask advice from the right people. Now, if I were to ask you today, do people stop and ask you for advice today, or do people listen today, yes or no? Let me try it this way. Raise your hand if you think people don't listen today. Okay? That looks like a good majority. I was thinking about this, and I'm going to have to say I disagree with you. Now let me throw it out here and see if you'll change your mind. When you think about what people do today, normally they will, I think, ask advice, but they don't ask the right people for advice. They'll tend to poll their friends that they know what's going to already say. They'll get some advice, they'll get maybe some support in the area they want to, but do they really listen to the right advice? Now, let me ask you again, do you think people today listen to that? I think they do. But the matter is, who are you listening to is a point here. And so there's some characters in here that didn't do a lot of checking advice, didn't do any counseling, went off on the deep end, and they lost out because of that. But Esther did not. And as we look at that, I want to consider one more passage here from 1 Kings, back before Esther now, in chapter 12. Let's see if I got the right one here. And verse 8. The individual here is named Rehoboam. He's a king over God's people. And some things were going on. So verse 6, it says, And King Rehoboam consulted the elders who stood before his father Solomon while he lived. And he said, How do you advise me to answer these people? That's smart. Go ask Dad's friends, because Dad never steered you right, and he has some good guys. So, verse 7, And they spoke to him, saying, If you'll be the servant of these people today, and serve them, etc., and so he gives them as their advice. But look at verse 8. But he rejected the advice which the elders had given him, and consulted the young men who had grown up with him, who stood before him. I like my guys better. Basically, you can say, yeah, well, he didn't listen to anybody, or you can say he did. But the thing is, we can listen to the wrong people, or we can listen to the right people. Wisdom calls for us to stop and think about who we ask for advice. Makes sense. I'm not saying you need to call the preacher on his phone all the time and ask him, but ask people that will give you godly advice. Ask people that you know make good choices. It just makes sense. Now, watch, occasionally I'll walk into a setting and Dr. Phil's playing, and I'll listen to him talking to people, and he's always got this unique puzzled look on his face, like, what were you when you asked that guy to help you? So, anyway, all right. Esther is a story of courage. I know it's a story of selflessness, but before you can get to that selfless stage, you've got to have some kind of courage to move out. To do that, you're going to have to trust. To that, I can also add to the fact that Esther respected authority of her uncle. That's an amazing thing to think about that, especially in our day and time. She wasn't on her own, although she was beautiful, she was chosen, she had a lot of things going in her direction, but Esther still stopped and thought about the consequences of who she was as God's person. And she appreciated and respected the influence that was there with this man. Another mention about influence in there is mentioned about the queen herself. The king, when he's engaged with a discussion about what do I do about this queen now who won't come, and so he goes and talks to his wise men, his council, and basically, as it's a discussion, they say, if word gets out to among all the other wives in this area that the princes, and that their wives say, well, I can do what I please, and there's a major rebellion in the kingdom. You see, influence is an important thing to consider on who we are as Christians. They considered it just in their realm, in their political influence realm. So there's something else that's in there. Well, as we look at what's going on, the background of Esther is mentioned in chapter 2. Now let's read verses 5 to 10, and we'll capture the story as it's moving along here. In Shushan, the citadel, where there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair and the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Good Jew, straight to the heart. Kish had been carried away, that's tribe back some time ago. The whole tribe had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So this is the Babylonian captivity. And after that comes the Medo-Persian Empire that comes in and takes over. And this is where we're finding this guy that's king right now. Verse 7. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, that was her other name, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. She did have, but they weren't living anymore, in other words. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. That's kind of like lovely twice, without a doubt. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Nice guy. And so it was that when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, now they're looking to replace Vashti, the queen now, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. My, what good fortune, what luck. I don't believe it's just luck. God has a purpose, and we'll see that in here, in the midst of this selfless individual that we're supposed to talk about from that perspective. It's hard for me to read this book and not see the overwhelming emphasis of God's purpose in the lives of people and the purpose that people have in serving God. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background of Esther. She's a beautiful person. She gets picked out. She comes into the kingdom as the king is looking to replace now this rebellious wife named Vashti. And when she comes in to see the king, it's an interesting thing, verses 11, 12, and 13. Esther, again, as we read here, had not been revealed her family, people of her family, being Jewish, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. That's a conscientious guy. And each young woman's turn came to go see the King Ahasuerus, after she had completed the 12 months. Did I say 12? Does it say it does? Sure it does. 12 months preparation before she even got to go in. Does that not drop your jaw open? This guy is fastidious, to say the least. Fix her up and do it right. 12 months preparation. According to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation a proportion. Here it is, ladies. Think about this. 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes, and the preparations for beautifying women. Wouldn't you like that sometime? These ladies would love to go to these different places, just for an afternoon or whatever. 6 months. I'd almost get bored, I think. I've never done it, don't plan to. It's not my lifestyle. But a whole year. This guy is somebody else. Before you even can see him the first time, before I even look at you, I want you to be ready for me to see. You've got to really look your best. Well, they go in to see the king, verses 13 and 14. Thus prepared each young woman, went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the woman's quarters to the king's palace. I scratched my head thinking, what would that be? I mean, if you were asked to go see a king, what would you take with her? I mean, if you were that, she's pondering, what do I take in there to impress this guy? A goblet with wine in it, a bunch of grapes, chocolate brownies. That'd do pretty good for me. What is she bringing into him? Verse 14, in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaskaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Hey, tell me that name. I kind of like it. When I read through this tonight, I read this afternoon again after going through it and all before, a thought popped into my mind as he's going in. She goes, would you accept this rose? You know, is this not exactly like, no it's not, but it's similar to this array of people, and which one gets chosen out of all of this? Bachelorette, or bachelor, whatever it is. Anyway, well, Esther stands out, verses 17 and 18. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. Why? Pause. Why? Because she was so charming. What was going on in his heart that changed him after all of these different people? God's going on. And he's doing something here. And he's got a plan in all of this operation. Verse 18. Then the king made a great feast, and he called it the Feast of Esther. Would you like to have a feast named after you? Feast of Alex. Well, let's put Carrie in there too. Feast of Alex and Carrie. The what else? We're going to celebrate the what else this year. We're going to have what else cake and what else ice cream and everything else that Alex love to eat. Okay. So they throw a feast, and they named it Esther. For all his officials and his servants, for he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces, and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. She melted his heart. This ruthless guy changed. Another thought to think about in the book of Esther. Changes can happen. We're watching God move through this entire thing, and as we're moving through this chapter, I want you to see what's going on. Now, the story really gets cool along in chapter 2 here, because in the midst of all of this stuff happening, there's a plot, and a couple of people try to take the king's life. And come to the rescue is Uncle Mordecai, but he doesn't get any credit for it. Verse 19. When the virgins were gathered together a second time, and Mordecai sat within the king's gate, because he's keeping an eye on you know who. Now Esther had not been revealed, again, we read this here, our family or people or whatever, Mordecai charged her. But in those days, verse 21, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, those two guys there's names, B and T, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, but somehow that got overlooked. Doesn't say it right there, but you see later it did. And when the inquiry had made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. But he wasn't really paying attention. He was just happy about stuff, and Esther's so good looking, and he forgot about the person. Later on, that'll come back around. So plot number 1 gets foiled, a good thing, king's saved. Strangely enough, in chapter 3, somebody that's not very nice, named Haman, gets promoted. Haman does not like what's going on, mainly because he doesn't like the Jewish people. But when it gets down to it, Mordecai, this is Esther's uncle now, in verse 2, after Haman makes this great law that he's now advanced up there, people got to bow before him, and Mordecai won't do it. I'm sorry. You're not the one I bow down to. He is. Won't do it to you. And so the plot thickens now. Wrath becomes an issue with Mordecai. He's wanting to rather with Haman, he wants to lay hands on Mordecai. And Haman's plot in verses 8 through 11 develops. And Haman comes to King, verse 11, King Ahasuerus, and he says, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in our province, in your kingdom. And their laws are different from all our other people. See how he's divisive here? And they do not keep the king's laws. Well, they had. But let's just throw it in there for good measure. And therefore, it's not fitting for the king to let them remain. Sounds pretty smart to me. And this is the guy he just promoted, so he must know what's going on here. So he adds a suggestion to it, verse 9. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And then he adds to that, and this is how much he hates this guy, I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring into the king's treasury. So I'll pay you just to get the law in. Wait a minute, we do something like that in our government. So we have people going in buying votes and getting out. Happened way back when, didn't it? Okay. So the king took his signet ring in his hand and gave it to Haman, and the law got set into effect. And it got read, etc. Okay, things are getting tough. Verse 3 of chapter 4. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Included in that is Uncle Mordecai, Esther's uncle. Esther, however, as you remember the story, she's okay. She's in the king's palace. She's beautiful. She's the only one with the final rose at the end of the whole ceremony. She's got it made. Almost. Well, verse 11, as we kind of read into the rest of the story here. All the king's servants, we already read this previously, and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who does go into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, and this would include Esther even at this point, but has one law, be put to death, except to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. And then Esther's saying, this is her words, yet I myself have not been called to go into the king for these 30 days. Has he forgotten about me? The month's gone by. Esther's held off. She's watching her people in distress, and she's not willing to respond at this point. These are bits of information that are now passed on. Verse 12 says, to Mordecai. They were Esther's words. And so Mordecai told them to answer to Esther. See, there's a person in between here because of some things going on. So Mordecai can't see her right then, mainly because he's in sackcloth and ashes and doesn't look good to walk in the king's court that way. So he got somebody else passing the information back and forth. And Mordecai told them to answer her, do not think in your heart that you're going to escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And then he asked this important, purposeful question. Yet who knows whether you've come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Why do you think God put you here? Do you think just because you're beautiful, all this, do you think that God has not done all this? She makes a selfless choice, which is the topic of this night's activities. Thinking about it, verse 15, Esther then told the reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. And my maids and I will likewise fast. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. She's caught, like a lot of us, in the midst of trying to figure out what to do. But I believe that she made as our topic, as a selfless choice, because it was obvious there wasn't anything else she really could do. But she could have tried to squeeze by, and most people probably do in settings like this. But she saw that God was involved in this whole thing. And as I look at this, and I've read that one passage particularly, Esther's response and Mordecai's comment for who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. That's a haunting question to me. And I find myself going home or by myself and asking myself this question, okay, what does God want of you now? I can look back and see how he's done some things. Not I've done some things, but he's done some things. And I know that God works in the lives of everybody, not just me. And so you could do the same thing. But it's always good to stop and think, okay, Lord, now, at this point, this time in my life, where I'm at this day, what do you want? And then make that selfless choice and say, okay, this is what I need to do. Well, there are two more bits that we don't have time to cover here about God's providence taking care of things. Not only do they escape out of that, but Mordecai gets exalted by a little activity here. Chapter 6, the king couldn't sleep one night, so he commanded some of his servants to bring the book of records and the chronicles to be read before the king. It kind of be like, you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go to sleep, so you reach over and you grab a cassette sermon from David Schonhoff, you put it in and think, this will help you go to sleep. And so this is what they did. They called for the records to be read. And the king's listening, though. He's still wide awake. And what the lesson in this story here is how there was somebody that saved his life back some time ago, and he didn't get the honor. And so when the king starts asking who it is, it ends up being Mordecai. And it gets discovered. And out of that, God's providence works back in here. Mordecai gets honored. But while he's working on how to honor this, the king calls, of all strange things, Haman in before him, and he's having this questioning, and he says, tell me, Haman, of course he didn't tell him who he's thinking of. He said, how would the king honor somebody that's really special? And Haman's thinking it's him. He said, oh man, I just really do this, and I'd give him this, and I'd put him on a horse, and I'd parade him around in front of everybody else and make him bow down. And after he gives this great long explanation thinking it's him, he says, good. I want you to take Mordecai out and do that because I just found out that it was him that saved my life back some time ago. Because he's been trying to do away with Mordecai, and Haman's just beside himself. And then the last part, not only is God's providence working in there, but his justice is. Because when you go through, and you'll have time maybe later tonight to go back and read that after a coffee break, but go home and look at it. Mordecai lets God take care of things, and Haman gets hanged on the gallows that he built, not only for himself, but he built it for Mordecai. And Mordecai gets honored in the process. Purpose? You betcha. Selflessness? Definitely. Providence? Surely. Careful who you listen to. Definitely. All there in the book of Esther. Is your life okay tonight? We sing a song. Before we leave here, before we leave these spiritual thoughts, make sure you're right with God. Make sure you're a Christian, baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. That's God's law speaking, not me. And then living according to what he wants you to do. Maybe you just need prayers. This is a great church, a great group of people, caring about everybody and wanting to stand with you. You need help, we're ready to help. Come while we stand and sing.